I would also, firstly, like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land upon which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pertama-tama saya ingin mengemukakan rasa hormat saya kepada para penduduk asli negeri ini, terutama suku Gadigal dari bangsa Eora. The project that I will eventually start talking about has also been supported by Arts Victoria and VCAM-CM, and I was mentored by Chivu. Need to acknowledge that. Okay, so the federal budget was announced in May, right? And there were a couple of shocking revelations that reverberated in the communities that I'm a part of. The first revelation was that the Minister for the Arts, George Brandis, was shifting $104.7 million away from the Australia Council to establish his own national program for excellence in the arts. Maybe some of you might have heard about that. Boo. Which has had immediate detrimental impact on people like me, independent artists. The second revelation is the shocking lack of new funding dedicated to services combating domestic violence. And through the communities that I moved through, I had many conversations, and some of the sentiments that kept being echoed over and over were, hang on, before we fund the arts, we need to attend to domestic violence first. Now, I'm not disputing that we have a domestic violence epidemic in this country, in fact, in this world, far from it. But what I would like to present today is not only that the two don't have to compete, and in fact that we need to fund both, one as much as the other, but also that art is also useful for the well-being and health of our communities. It's just that maybe sometimes we can't quantify it as easily. You see, I used to be a social worker. And I spent the first 5 years of my professional life working in homeless shelters, women's shelters, family shelters in King's Cross, Redfern, Surrey Hills, just down the road here. You name it, inner city Sydney, been there. And I fell in love with performing halfway through my social work degree, but I really resisted the call to committing to becoming an artist because I thought to myself, what use would being an artist be to society? Flashback. To May 1998 in Jakarta. It's the hot, humid, crowded capital city of Indonesia, where I grew up. At the time, I was barely 12 years old, and I'd been kept home from school. So, of course, I spent the whole day glued to the television and the radio, but not for reasons you'd expect. It was so that I could keep a tab on the violence brewing outside my home. And as I waited for my parents to come home from the day, I didn't know whether they were going to come home from the day, the restlessness just kept building and building and building to the point where I had to do something. I don't know what it was, but something. I wanted to look for myself. And in my house, there's a water tower on the second floor, and if you climb up it, you have a good view of the city. So in spite of my fear of heights, I climbed one by one the rung on the ladders, and I looked around. And what I saw was 3 plumes of huge black smoke rising up to the sky. I was literally watching as the city that I grew up in burnt around me. Welcome to the May riots of 1998. But enough from me, let's have a listen to an eyewitness account by a human rights activist, Kalina Supeli, who at the time of the riots was riding the back of an ambulance trying to help the victims of this violence.
Cina. Tapi sekali lagi yang bukan menakutkan ya, tapi gentar ya, rasa gentar gitu, bahwa kenapa orang bisa menjadi sedemikian marah dan amuk ya, amuk istilah yang tepat itu amuk masa, karena lalu menjadi sangat kacau balau. I saw fires and people were just like, I don't know what kind of evil were inside them. You can see anger, so much hatred in their eyes. We were so scared, but I kept telling the driver, move on, and just tell them, yell at them that we try to help, we have food.
The May riots of 1998 were racially targeted mass violence that exploded across 5 major capital cities in Indonesia, including the city where I grew up, Jakarta, almost simultaneously. Thousands of people died, and hundreds of Chinese Indonesian women who look like me, were brutally sexually violated in broad daylight. Now, it's important to note that not all of the victims were Chinese Indonesian, but that the violence was very much targeted to Chinese Indonesian quarters, shopping districts, etc. What do I mean by Chinese Indonesian? For those of you who don't know, it can mean a range of things, but essentially, it's an Indonesian person, Indonesian citizen, who has ancestry from mainland China somewhere along the line. So in the case of my family, it was 4 to 5 generations ago. But I grew up staunchly and proudly believing that I was Indonesian. Next slide. The effect that this mass violence had on my identity was pretty profound. It caused a schism in my identity. According to my mother, I came home from school one day and asked her, "Ma, kita ini orang Cina. Ma, are we Chinese?" To which she responded, "No, Rani, we are Indonesian." But, you know, I was young, and the hatred that I saw around me being directed at Chinese Indonesian people, I started directing inwards and towards myself. I began to hate myself. I thought that there was something essentially wrong with me, about the blood flowing in my veins, the color of my skin, the shape of my eyes, whatever, you name it. And that's why the riots had happened. It was only with growing awareness, once I started attending Sydney University down the road here, that I realized that the May riots of 1998 were only the most recent manifestation in history of Chinese Indonesian people being the scapegoat for whoever the ruling government was, whether it was a Dutch colonial government or the ruling Indonesian government, who painted Chinese Indonesian people as the rich people, lording over all other ethnic groups. So of course, whenever there was civil unrest, it was the Chinese that got blamed. Fast forward 2014. Out of this early experience of hatred, I led the creation of this. Chinese Whispers was a maze made of cloth that audiences entered one by one or in pairs to have a solitary meditative journey guided by a 40-minute audio story, my story. And this experience was peppered with questions about race that are also relevant for the Australian context. So for example, I asked audiences to reflect on the question of what are the labels that we use here to incite fear in Australia? I didn't want people to go, "Oh, isn't that horrible, that thing that happened over there," and then exit. I wanted them to see how issues of race, racial-based violence, gender-based violence were precisely the issues that we need to be talking about here. The experience culminated in an interaction with a live actor who was essentially just there to listen to your responses. And we found that Australian audiences of many, many, many different cultural backgrounds stayed for hours, and they made the connection to speak and reflect about Islamophobia, indigenous genocides, our treatment of asylum seekers, refugees, and so on. Here is some of the impact on the audiences, and I quote, next one. "A finely pitched and gently powerful piece that creates a much-needed space of contemplation on issues of race, difference, violence, and universality of humanness. I had inadvertently discovered a bold new way of confronting people on issues of race and gender-based violence in a way that was surprisingly gentle. Walking through the labyrinth persuaded people to engage on confronting issues that would normally be met with anger, defensiveness, denial. Chinese Whispers created an opportunity for reflecting on the dark spots in our personal and collective histories, to learn from them, so we can keep maturing as individuals and as a society. This is how my art is useful to society. My work is a humble opportunity for people to perceive one another as fully human, and then perhaps we would be less likely to kill, abuse, rape, or hurt one another. So, when faced with George Brandis's accusation of independent artists being artists who are only responsible to themselves, therefore why should the taxpayer fund them, etc., I say this. I am an independent artist. Oh God, I always tear up at this bit. What is with that? I am an independent artist, and I make my art with the same love with which I used to hold women's hands in the women's shelter, and with my attention, hold them, perceive them as fully human at the lowest point in their lives, and support them as they lived another day. It is that same intent. It is that same love for another human being that creates my art. So far from being responsible only to myself, my work is propelled by the question, what can my artistic work contribute to society? So if you support what I do, and if you support what my peers today do, please, I urge you to sign the online petition, Australians for Artistic Freedom. Thank you.